One of the really cool things about learning how to reason well is that there are really only a few laws of logic and rules of inference that literally govern all reasoning in the entire universe. So, having a grasp of the laws of logic and the rules of inference can really help us to be better critical thinkers and evaluate whether the things that people say are true, false, or generally just well reasoned or poorly reasoned. So, getting right into it, we're going to start with the three laws of logic, and in no particular order, we're going to start with the law of identity. This law says that for anything A is itself and isn't something else like B. So, for example, I am not a potato. I am a human being. So, Daniel is Daniel, a human being, but Daniel is not a potato. Super simple. Second law is called the law of non contradiction. This law says that for any statement that can be true or false, it can not be true and false at the same time in the same sense. So, for example, a contradiction would be if I were to say, hey, I am Daniel, okay, I exist and I don't exist. So, existence and non existence are direct contradictories of each other. So, I cannot exist and not exist in the same time at the same sense, according to the law of non contradiction. So, totally works just universally. These are not disputed, by the way. These are just, you know, part of the essential properties of reasoning. And then the third law is the law of excluded middle. So this law says that for any statement that intends to say something true about the world, it can only be true or false. So it can't be anything in the middle. So sometimes people might think, oh, like I feel confident that this is true, but I'm not sure. That's a question of what's called epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and justification. But in terms of the statements or propositions, whatever we want to call them, themselves, they can only either be true or false, regardless of what we believe about them, or regardless too of what level of confidence we have in those beliefs. So, getting right into the rules of inference, there's only like a handful, less than 10, that really help us understand like literally all inferences in all of reasoning. So, the first one is called modus ponens. And this one is structured like this: if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. And so, what do I mean by P and Q? In this scheme, P and Q really are symbolic representations of what are called declarative statements. So I mentioned earlier when talking about the laws of logic that any statement that intends to say something true about the world is subject to the laws of logic. Same with the rules of inference. We just call these statements declarative statements or propositions. There's a few names for them, but these are really just things that are meant to say something about the way the world really is. So, an example of something that's a sentence that's not one of these is like, hey, shut the door. That's a command, and that's not true or false. But saying, like, oh, bugs are animals, like, that's something that's either true or false. We're trying to say something that corresponds to the way the world actually is. So, the way modus ponens works is it's just set up with a conditional in the first statement of the argument. And real quick, an argument really is just a structured step by step scheme of reasoning where the statements that support the end statement are called premises and the end statement is called the conclusion. So the first premise is in modus ponens is a conditional of the form if P then Q, again where P and Q are declarative statements. And then the second premise is P. And then the conclusion, which is the final statement in the argument, is Q. And that's just the way logic works for this scheme. So anytime you have an argument of that form and both of the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So for example, if Socrates was a man, then Socrates was mortal. Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates was mortal. And in this argument, both of the premises are true. and that means that the conclusion must be true just by virtue of modus ponens. When an argument is structured such that its premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, if they're both true, then we call these valid arguments. And if an argument is valid and it has true premises, then we call this a sound argument. So those are just some terms. But moving on to the second rule of inference, we have modus tollens. So in some ways, it's very similar to modus ponens, just a little bit different. So this is of the form, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So again, like modus ponens, our first premise is a conditional, but the second premise is the contradiction of the second part of the conditional, the first premise, and we call this the consequent. In a conditional, we have the first part, so in modus ponens, it's if P, and then we have the second part, which is like then Q, and those two parts are called the antecedent and the consequent. So just more terms, there's no quiz or anything, but just throwing it out there. Yeah, moving on to another one, we have disjunctive syllogism, a fancy name for this scheme of argument, which is where we have a disjunction, which is where we have two declarative statements combined with the operator of or. So for example, we can say P or Q, and then filling those letters in with actual statements, we can say grass is green or grass is blue. And then for our second premise of disjunctive syllogism, we will deny one of the disjuncts. A disjunct is just one part of the disjunction. So we can say it is false that grass is blue, or we could say that a few different ways in English, like grass is not blue. And then once we say that, then we can conclude validly that, okay, then grass must be green. So with disjunctive syllogism, we're just denying one of the disjuncts, and then we're concluding with the other. Another inference rule is hypothetical syllogism. So this gets kind of cool because there's basically a chain of reasoning happening here where we will have a few conditionals, like if P then Q, and then we can do if Q then S, and then we can conclude by saying if P then S. And the way this works is there's two conditionals for both of the premises, or a conditional for each of the premises. And then just by way of thinking about how these conditionals are structured and the rules of logic we've learned before, we know that if P is true, then by modus ponens, Q is also true for the first premise. And then we also know that if Q is true, then R is true by way of modus ponens again. So we know that if P is Q, then what did I say? R? Yeah, I'll just go with R. If P is Q, then we know that R is true. Or I might have said S earlier. Either way, the way that hypothetical syllogism works is you're basically combining two conditionals where the consequent of one is the antecedent of the other, and then you're supplying the relevant other premise to allow you to kind of combine the conditionals in a way into one other conditional for the conclusion. And there's several other rules of inference, but for this video, I'm just going to call it good there and just get everyone exploring just some of the fun that comes with logic and inference. So hope that was fun. Talk to you soon.